Have you ever been casually going about your day when someone comes at you, demanding your ID? That's exactly what happened to me, except the person who tried it didn't realize who they were dealing with. She was an HOA Karen trying to flex her power, but what she didn't know was that I wasn't just any neighbor. My name is Daniel Carter, and I've been living in a quiet suburban neighborhood for over 15 years. Now, I'm no stranger to the odd conflict that pops up when you live in a place with a homeowners association. It comes with the territory. People who think they have a say in how you maintain your property, what color your mailbox should be, or how tall your grass can grow. But that's not what I'm here to talk about. No, my story isn't about some silly HOA fine over an overgrown bush or a fence that's a couple inches too high. This is the story of how one overly ambitious HOA Karen decided to pick a fight with me. And let me just say, she had no idea what she was getting herself into. You see, I'm not just any homeowner in the neighborhood. I'm not some guy who just nods along when people try to push me around. I'm a judge. And, well, that's where things get interesting. I'd recently denied an appeal she'd put forward to have certain rules bent in her favor. Not to sound arrogant, but as a judge, I'm used to making tough decisions, and I don't make them lightly. That's why when Karen didn't get what she wanted, she wasn't happy. But I didn't expect her to go as far as she did. One afternoon, as I was getting out of my car, I was met with an overly strict request from Karen. She demanded to see my ID. For what reason? Because she thought she could. It wasn't just about rules. It was about control. And Karen, clearly thinking she had the upper hand, had no clue I was the very judge who had rejected her appeal. So, there I stood, watching her face turn pale with realization as the truth hit her like a freight train. But what happened next? Well, that's the part that turned this whole situation upside down. Stick around, because you won't believe how this story unfolds. The tension between homeowners and their homeowners associations, HOA, is nothing new. I've lived through the petty fines for things like trimming the hedge just a little too much or painting the fence the wrong shade of brown. At first, I didn't think much of it. I'm the type of guy who's content with my home, my family, and my privacy. But when Karen, the neighborhood's self-appointed enforcer, started making things more personal, that's when the real trouble began. Karen had been a thorn in the side of the entire community for years. If you didn't live up to her standards, you were invited to attend HOA meetings where you'd be lectured about your lawn care techniques or how you were undermining the perfect image of the neighborhood. She didn't care much for the relaxed, friendly atmosphere that most of us enjoyed. To her, the HOA was a power tool to maintain control over everyone around her. It all started innocently enough. At least, that's how it seemed at first. Karen had approached me several times over the years about various infractions around my house. One year, it was about the slightly off-center garden gnome I had placed in my front yard. Apparently, it was too whimsical for the HOA's aesthetic. Another time, she came knocking at my door about the shade of blue I'd chosen to paint my garage. It wasn't neutrally acceptable. As a judge, I'd seen my fair share of complaints. I'm no stranger to difficult personalities, and I try to remain calm and respectful even in the face of people who can't see eye to eye with me. But Karen didn't know how to let things go. If anything, she grew more insistent with every complaint, and it began to feel less like a neighborly suggestion and more like an obsession. One afternoon, I was returning home from work, looking forward to a quiet evening. My wife had planned a small family dinner, and I could already smell the garlic from the kitchen. The usual sense of peace that filled my chest when I pulled in my driveway was replaced with unease when I saw Karen standing by the mailbox, staring at me with a determined look in her eyes. "Daniel, I need to speak to you about something," she said, her tone overly firm. I sighed internally, but made my way over to her. Before I could even ask what was going on, she dropped her bombshell. "I need to see your ID," Karen demanded, holding out her hand as if she had the authority to make such a request. At first, I thought I misheard her. "What for?" I asked, the confusion in my voice clearly evident. Was this some kind of joke? She stared at me, unblinking. "You heard me. I need to verify your identity." I paused for a moment, trying to comprehend the absurdity of it all. "Why did you want to see my ID? Was there some sort of issue?" I started to wonder if she was out of her mind. But then it clicked. This wasn't about identity. This was about control. Karen had found a new way to assert her power, and this time, she was crossing a line. "Karen, what is this about?" I asked, my patience starting to thin. "I don't know what you're getting at, but this is ridiculous. You think you can get away with everything in this neighborhood just because you're a judge?" She shot back, her tone sharp and accusing. "You think you can ignore the rules of the HOA?" And that's when it hit me. This wasn't just about me being a homeowner. It wasn't about her enforcing the rules of the HOA. This was personal. Karen had been nursing a grudge ever since I had ruled against her in a recent appeal she had filed with the HOA board. Her appeal had been about some renovations she wanted to make to her property that didn't quite fit the guidelines. But as a judge, I had reviewed the case and, following the law, ruled against her. For some reason, Karen couldn't accept that. To her, this wasn't about fairness or the rules. It was about her being right, and anyone who disagreed with her was an enemy. "I don't need to show you my ID," I said, stepping back and raising my hands, trying to remain calm. "And this is absurd." But Karen wasn't backing down. She wasn't going to let it go, not after everything. The truth of the matter was, she thought she could bully me into submission just because she believed she had some sort of power over the neighborhood. The idea that a judge could live in her neighborhood, still able to uphold the law and make decisions against her, was more than she could bear. "I'll be calling the HOA," she snapped, turning on her heel. "This will be handled." As she stormed off, I realized that this wasn't just some petty neighbor issue anymore. This was the beginning of something much bigger. It was a battle for control, not just over the neighborhood, but over my own life, my own home, and my own right to live peacefully without being constantly harassed by someone who thought they could dictate how everyone should live. As I stood there, watching Karen march back to her house, the frustration boiled inside me. I couldn't believe what had just happened. I had never expected to face something like this in my own neighborhood. Sure, there had been minor annoyances over the years, but this was different. Karen wasn't just being a neighborly nuisance. She was trying to undermine my authority and my right to live peacefully in my own home. It was personal now, and I wasn't about to let her dictate the terms of my life. But what really hit me was the realization that Karen wasn't just a petty neighbor. She had been empowered by her role in the HOA, a position that, like a title, had gone straight to her head. This wasn't about enforcing neighborhood rules or maintaining a sense of order. This was about control, and that, I knew, was something I could not let her have. I spent the next few days stewing over the incident. Karen's unreasonable demands, her condescending attitude, and her blatant attempt to undermine me. It all swirled in my head. But I wasn't going to react in anger. That's not who I was, and I wasn't about to let her get under my skin like that. I decided I was going to handle this methodically, just as I would any other legal case. That afternoon, as I sat at my kitchen table, I found myself going over the HOA's bylaws and regulations. I had access to public records, and being a judge, I knew how to navigate legal documents. I needed to know exactly what rights Karen had, what powers the HOA could wield, and where the boundaries lay. What I discovered shocked me. While the HOA had the power to enforce rules within the neighborhood, such as landscape standards, fence heights, and architectural guidelines, their reach was not as far as Karen thought it was, and certainly not as far as she had been pretending it was. There were clear limits to their authority, and they could not infringe upon private property rights. In fact, I found that several of the HOA's recent decisions, including Karen's own grievances, were questionable at best. That gave me an idea. I wasn't just going to let Karen's ridiculous demands slide. If she thought she could push me around with her power-hungry attitude, she had another thing coming. The turning point came the next morning when I received an official letter from the HOA, informing me that they were filing a formal complaint against me for violating community standards. The letter went on to mention that my property had become a source of tension, and that they were concerned about the negative impact I was having on the neighborhood. The complaint, of course, had nothing to do with any legitimate violations of the rules. It was retaliation, plain and simple. Karen had managed to convince the board to make this move, using her influence and her reputation within the HOA. That was it. I could feel the weight of the injustice pressing down on me. I knew Karen was behind this. I could almost hear her voice, that same smug tone, as she sat in her perfectly manicured living room, scheming against me. I wasn't just going to sit back and let her win. I called up an old friend of mine, John Harris, who was a top attorney with years of experience in property and HOA law. John had helped me with several legal matters over the years, and I knew he'd have the insight I needed. After a quick rundown of the situation, he listened quietly, then gave me a clear, no-nonsense response. Dan, you've got one option here. You take the fight to them. You expose them for what they are. You know the law better than anyone, and the HOA has been operating outside of it. If you push back hard enough, they'll be forced to back off. It's your right. I felt a surge of determination. I had been underestimating my own power in this situation. As a judge, I had the ability to look at things from a legal perspective, to scrutinize evidence, and to uphold the law. But I was also a homeowner with a right to peace and quiet. Karen and the HOA had crossed a line. Now it was time to fight back. The turning point for me was realizing that I didn't have to let Karen control my life. She wasn't above the law. The HOA wasn't some unstoppable machine. I had the tools to fight back, not just in a courtroom, but in a way that would actually make an impact on the neighborhood. I started gathering evidence. I took photos of my property, making sure to capture every inch of land and structure that was clearly mine. I pulled out the record from a neighborhood, documenting the decisions the HOA had made and highlighting the questionable ones. I began preparing for a formal response, one that would not only challenge the HOA's actions, but would also shine a light on Karen's shady dealings behind the scenes. I reached out to several neighbors who had been on the receiving end of Karen's overbearing behavior. They, too, had been unfairly targeted, their properties scrutinized for the most trivial of reasons. Some of them were nervous to speak out, fearing retaliation from the HOA, but many of them were eager to stand with me. It became clear that Karen's reign of power was built on fear and intimidation, and that I wasn't the only one who had been wronged. Armed with this information, I knew I had the upper hand. Karen may have had the HOA's backing, but I had something far more powerful, the truth. And as the saying goes, the truth is unstoppable. The time for playing nice was over. I was going to fight back, and I was going to win. Karen had made a huge mistake, and now she was going to regret it. But more than just teaching Karen a lesson, this was about taking a stand against an unjust system that had been exploiting its power for far too long. And that's exactly what I was going to do. The day had come. The letter from the HOA had arrived in my mailbox, and with it, the official complaint that Karen had managed to manipulate the board into issuing. As a judge, I knew the importance of evidence. I'd spent the past several days carefully documenting everything, taking photos of my property, recording all communications with the HOA, and compiling all the legal grounds I needed to challenge their actions. What stood out most was the brazen nature of Karen's attempt to destroy my peace and break the very fabric of the community we both lived in. She was pushing me, trying to provoke me into doing something reckless, but I wasn't going to fall for it. No, I wasn't just going to fight her legally. I was going to make her see the truth, that her efforts to tear me down had consequences that would ripple through the HOA, the neighborhood, and ultimately her life. The moment I had been preparing for arrived with a call from John, the attorney. He was ready, he said, to take the fight to court. But as I prepared to gather the final bits of evidence, I realized something important. I didn't have to just fight back in the courtroom. I had the chance to expose Karen in a way that would force the HOA to reconsider their stance entirely. I'd spent years as a judge, understanding every nuance of the law, and it was time to use that knowledge to my advantage. This wasn't just about a small dispute over property. This was about standing up against an abuse of power, not just by Karen, but by the entire HOA, which had been complicit in this long-running series of abuses. So, I decided to take a more aggressive approach. Rather than just submitting paperwork and attending hearings, I would make sure that everyone in the neighborhood knew exactly who Karen was. I would make it clear how far she was willing to go in her power trip. I wasn't just going to fight in court. I was going to make sure that the entire HOA knew what kind of person they were defending. I reached out to a few of the neighbors who had suffered at the hands of Karen's manipulations. These were the same people who had been afraid to speak out, afraid of retaliation or fines. But now, with Karen targeting me, they finally understood that I wasn't just a judge. I was their ally in this fight. Several of them offered to stand by me in court and share their stories. One of them, Mrs. Anderson, had been harassed for months by Karen over something as trivial as the color of her mailbox. The HOA had fined her multiple times for an alleged violation, which turned out to be a complete fabrication. Mrs. Anderson was reluctant to speak up initially, afraid of how Karen might retaliate. But when I showed her the legal documentation, she knew she had to stand up. Another neighbor, Mr. Jacobson, had been repeatedly fined for having a small vegetable garden in his backyard. Karen had called it unsightly, though every other neighbor had their flower beds and lawns perfectly manicured. It was clear that Karen's goal was never about keeping the neighborhood in compliance, but about maintaining her own control. As the day of the hearing drew closer, my tension grew. I had prepared every piece of evidence, secured testimony from my neighbors, and gathered all the legal precedents I could use to make my case stronger. But more than the legal battle, this felt like a fight for something deeper, my right to live in peace, and to ensure that Karen's reign of terror wouldn't continue. When the day arrived, I wasn't just walking into a courtroom to contest a complaint. I was about to turn the tables on Karen and the HOA. This was more than just a matter of legal formalities. It was about reclaiming power from someone who thought she could control others with fear and intimidation. Karen walked into the courtroom with her usual confidence. Her demeanor hadn't changed one bit. She still looked as though she was invincible, as if no one could ever challenge her authority. She glanced at me briefly, then went straight to the table reserved for the HOA's representatives. The air was thick with tension, and I could feel the anticipation building in the room. The first few minutes were filled with standard procedures. The judge called the case and asked for opening statements. Karen stood first, with her usual haughty expression, speaking about how she was merely doing her duty as a member of the HOA, ensuring that the neighborhood adhered to its rules. She presented the complaint, pointing to the alleged violations I had made. But then it was my turn. I stood up slowly, gathering my thoughts. I was about to do something that would completely upend Karen's position. I started by showing the evidence I had meticulously gathered. I presented the complaint from the HOA, but I also introduced the records I dug up about Karen's past behavior and how she had been repeatedly abusing her position for years. I had legal documents from neighbors who were willing to testify that Karen had misused her power. But the game changer came when I revealed Karen's involvement in filing false complaints and manipulating the HOA into acting on her personal vendettas. I had uncovered her history of filing multiple complaints against neighbors for trivial issues, using her influence to punish anyone she deemed a threat to her vision of perfection. I showed how she had financially burdened the community and used her position to force people into submission. As the room absorbed the truth, Karen's expression changed. The confident smile melted from her face, replaced by a flicker of panic. She shifted uncomfortably in her seat, but I wasn't done. I showed the video footage I had gathered, footage of Karen personally overseeing and pressuring the HOA board, making threats to neighbors who didn't conform to her exacting standards. I had always believed in the power of truth, and it was at that moment that I knew Karen was about to lose. I had her. The evidence was undeniable. I had her cornered in a way she couldn't escape. She had no excuse, no way to defend herself. When I finished, the judge asked Karen if she had anything else to say. Her voice trembled as she stood up. "This is all a misunderstanding," she began weakly, but the words lacked conviction. I was just trying to do my job, but the truth had already set the stage. The room could feel the shift in power. Her authority was crumbling. At that moment, I knew that Karen's reign of terror was over. She had underestimated me, underestimated my knowledge of the law and the strength of my resolve. As I stood there, watching Karen flounder, I realized that this wasn't just about a personal dispute. It was about fighting for the integrity of the community. It was about showing everyone that power could be used for good, not to control or intimidate. And above all, It was about taking a stand and refusing to let someone like Karen dictate the terms of your life. The courtroom was dead silent as Karen sat there, her face pale, trying to hold on to whatever shred of dignity she could muster. The judge made his decision, ruling in my favor, dismissing the HOA's complaint against me entirely. But the repercussions of the case didn't stop there. As I walked out of the courtroom, I could see the news reporters gathering. Word had spread like wildfire, and what started as a minor dispute about neighborhood rules had turned into a much larger story. People were starting to realize just how much power Karen had been wielding and how far she was willing to go to control those around her. In the days that followed, neighbors who had been too afraid to speak up came forward with their own stories of Karen's manipulations. They shared how Karen had tried to fine them for the smallest infractions, how she had used her position as HOA president to make their lives miserable just because they didn't conform to her perfect vision of the neighborhood. And, much to my surprise, people began calling me, thanking me for taking a stand, for showing that someone could fight back against a tyrant in their midst. Even those who had remained silent for so long realized they weren't alone. The ripple effects of Karen's downfall were felt across the entire neighborhood. The HOA board was forced to reevaluate its structure and its leadership. New members, ones who understood that their responsibility was to the community, not to control it, were elected. The pressure of the lawsuit was too much for Karen to handle, and she resigned from her position, retreating from the public eye. She disappeared into the shadows, her reputation destroyed beyond repair. The community, once divided, started to rebuild. It wasn't just about the HOA anymore. It was about neighbors coming together, standing up for their rights, and realizing that they didn't have to live in fear of someone who had abused their power. This battle wasn't just a personal victory. It became a beacon for others in similar situations. Neighbors from nearby communities reached out, asking how they could stand up to HOA corruption. The story spread, and soon it became part of a larger conversation about HOA overreach and abuse of power. What Karen didn't realize when she started this war was that she wasn't just messing with me. She was igniting a spark that would light up the entire community. It was a reminder to everyone that sometimes the fight for justice isn't about going quietly along with the system, but about challenging the status quo. The bigger lesson here is that no matter who you are, no one has the right to take away your peace or manipulate you through fear. And if you're willing to fight for what's right, you can bring about real change. The broader impact is that it changed the way people viewed power dynamics in their own neighborhoods. No longer were HOA leaders seen as untouchable figures who could simply enforce arbitrary rules. People began to understand that the community had the power to hold them accountable, that it wasn't just a matter of following orders, but of questioning authority when necessary. This wasn't about revenge, it was about standing up to abuse. And the more we speak out against those who try to control us, the more we create spaces where fairness, respect, and democracy can thrive. If you've ever felt bullied by a system or an authority figure, it's time to speak up. Stand your ground, challenge the system, and let others know they're not alone. Together, we can make a difference.